Today we'll be discussing films, documentaries, and filmmaking with Mr. Vikram Jayanti. And Mr. Vikram is a documentary filmmaker. If you do, many of you might not be aware with documentaries, but he's made some really good documentaries, and he's made documentaries on some uh, really big people such as Gary Kasparov and Phil Spector and others. And besides that, he is two of the movies that he's produced have won Academy Awards for the best documentary film. So, Vikramji, hi, so nice seeing you. I hope you're fine.
Hi there. I'm fine. Glad to talk with you.
One thing I'd really love to know is that you're born in your father was an Indian, and uh, how was your childhood like? Where were you born, and what was your journey, and when did you like really get interested in films? That's something I really want to know.
Okay. Um, my father, who's from Andhra Pradesh, moved to America in 1948, where he married my mother, who was a Russian, first generation American and Jewish. And so I was born in New York, and but most of my life until I went out on my own was in Europe. My first language was Italian. I was at preschool in Milan when I was 2. And we had a place in Geneva. My father made quite a lot of money at times. And so we lived, we had quite a lot of places to live. So I grew up in the south of France and in London and in Geneva, with a few occasional stays in India. When the Chinese invaded India in the early 60s, a lot of the sort of prominent people who had money rushed away from India. My father deliberately moved us back very publicly to Delhi. And I think we spent 7 months perhaps that year in Delhi. But in the mid 60s, I was at school for a year in New York State. And but when I was 12, my father and his wife, not my mother who had died, moved to Central America. And I did not want to move I felt it was more important for me to get a centralized education than to live in a developing country. Much so I love developing countries. So at 12, I left home. And I found a boarding school on my own in England, and I went to it. At that point, England seemed like the most stable and culturally interesting to me country at the time. And I then took my first degree at university in Britain. In my at times I thought I'd either be an English professor of English literature, which is actually world literature is my passion. But I also painted, and I was beginning to build a reputation as a young painter. But then I saw a film in my second year at university. So I was 20, I guess. So that was 1975. I saw a film by Werner Herzog called The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, which is not a documentary. But the opening shot, or one of the opening, somewhere in the film, I think it's an opening shot, was an extraordinary single unmoving camera shot of a wheat field blowing crazily as the wind tormented it. And to me, it was like a painting that had come alive. And I thought, gosh, if I could get that kind of result as a filmmaker, I'd rather do that than painting.
Oh.
So when I finished university, I was 20, and a friend of mine from Cambridge, John Stroud, and I started a little film company. And we asked all our friends to give us £5, £15, £25, and we sold them shares in the film that I'd written and John starred in, and we co-directed. And at the end of that, John took his copy of the film to London Weekend Television, I think, or became a trainee director. And I took mine to Los Angeles because I was tired of the rain and tired of having endless sniffles, and I thought I'd go to LA and make movies. And my girlfriend wanted to do anthropology at university, and she got into a university in Southern California, and I had my mother's sister living briefly in Southern California, so we had a place to stay. And in 1977, when I was 22, we moved. I had 160 vinyl records and 2 pairs of jeans and about $200, and we moved to Hollywood. I learned very quickly that I didn't have the killer instinct. LA in the late 70s, Los Angeles was a really open city. You could meet anybody you wanted. It was a relaxed, confident, and interesting cultural place. And it was slow. It wasn't like New York. It wasn't like London. It wasn't like Delhi. It was relaxed. I mean, of course, it had the movie business, which is not a relaxed business, but you could, if I wanted to meet the head of a studio in those days, you could just meet them. So I met a lot of directors early on, and I realized that what I did not have in common with them was the killer instinct. I think directors who are good or successful will do anything to get their films made, and I was never that aggressive. Meanwhile, my girlfriend was doing anthropology at a university in Los Angeles, and she got an internship on a documentary film project out of the University of Southern California, which is where one of America's greatest film schools is. And they wanted an intern because the anthropology department there was making a film in Bali, in Indonesia, Hindu Buddhist island.
Yeah.
And they took her because she actually had grown up in Indonesia and spoke both Balinese and Javanese. Although her name was Caroline Carruthers, she was very old school English. Her father was a sort of colonial banker. And when they came back, they didn't, since this department had never made a film, they didn't know how to get the financing or anything to finish it. And I always looked, because of my family background, as if I knew my way around money. And so they hired me at $6 an hour to raise the rest of the money for their film. I thought to myself, maybe that's what I should do. I should produce for a while until I know where the money is, and then I'll direct. I still wasn't expecting to make documentaries my career. But I raised the money. The university had a big success with this film called The Three Worlds of Bali. And it was my first, it went national. It was a big success across America. And the university department hired me to help set up a thing called the Center for Visual Anthropology and to be the sort of house producer. I did that for 8 years. And what I was doing was I was finding academic work that interested me, that I thought could be turned into a film. And then I'd work with the anthropologist, and I'd raise the money, and so as a result, I made several films as a producer, and I became good at it. And then Reagan became president, and much of the money that you would raise inside the academy, not the Academy Awards, the university environment, came from public funds, whether it was governmental things like the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment for the Humanities, or foundations. It was sort of tax-deductible money. And I realized I was now competing in raising money for my films and the university's films with widows and orphans and poor people and sick people, because I was raising so much money, but the Reagan government was drying up the sources of support for all kinds of things, not just the arts, but health programs and social welfare programs. And so I decided it was time to see if the kind of films I was making could be funded in the marketplace. So I left the university. I ran a film festival for a couple of years, which at the time was the world's biggest documentary festival out of Los Angeles, 2 years running. And with that, I was able to meet all the people who paid commissioned films in European and American television, because I would bring them over to the festival and I'd premiere films. So I had a very good network when I left the university. And I got my first BBC commission directly to me when I was in 89. So I was 34 or 30, I was 33. And I began making my own films independently. And I did somehow or other, I got a lot of films funded for myself. I mean, I've actually either produced or directed 70 films, 70, since I was 26 or so. And I've always liked films that people would talk about. So whether by accident or deliberately, I've made films that get a lot of public response and exposure. And I moved out of anthropology into general things that fascinated me about our popular culture. And one of the things that I became known for was films about sort of geniuses in trouble.
Okay.
And I think what I've been doing for much of my life is making films about my father through the lives of these other larger than life characters. My father was a much larger than life character who got in trouble. Mm-hmm. So they at the BBC they call maybe 10 of my films. It's the American Monsters series is the nickname that was given to it by a BBC commissioner. Most of my films are co-productions between British television and American television. I mean, I've had co-productions with French, German, Belgian, Swedish, Finnish, Australian. You do whatever you can to fund a film, but they've all been documentaries. And my production company is based in England, even though I was living in Los Angeles, where I lived for 34 years. But I'm very comfortable because of having gone to school, and my first wife was English, and my current wife is English. So I've always had a foot in both countries, and that kind of helped because I was the go-to guy for a long time for high-end British television about American social phenomena, and vice versa. Americans knew I could get co-funding out of Britain, usually the BBC. So I just, but I was still producing. I produced in the Soviet Union a film in 88, 89. I think I've filmed in 40 different countries altogether. I think of a country I'd like to visit, and then I'll wander over there, often with one of my daughters, and then come away thinking, yeah, I found a film, because I want to see more of that country. Okay. I've made a few films in South India. I've made films in Vietnam, and I've worked in Brazil and China. As I said, the Soviet Union, and then post-Soviet Union, Russia.
Yeah.
Every country in Europe, in Africa, Morocco, Senegal, Mali, and Gambia, which is a horrible country. Countries where you find if you put BBC on a placard in your window, you can go through sort of police blockades and stuff like that. Even when you're not making film for BBC, there's a sort of global reputation that they have.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
So that can be handy. Except once when I was pulled over trying to get some footage of the White House in Washington, D.C., and we got yanked out of our van and just about arrested. And I said to impress them that we were doing a BBC film, which it might have actually been a BBC film. And at that moment, they were very angry at the BBC in America. So that took a whole day to extricate ourselves from. But the real question I think you're asking me is about, though you haven't articulated it, I have a very different idea about documentaries from what most of your audience probably has.
Yeah.
In most of the world, including America and Britain, documentaries are essentially informative, and they are kind of, at their worst, illustrated lectures.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Whereas I see documentary as an absolutely exciting part of cinema. I shoot my films as if they're movies. I don't look for information. I look for experience and feeling and emotion and drama. So I always shoot my films as if, and the result is many of them have had theatrical release.
Yeah.
And I don't know, the Phil Spector film opened in New York and ran for 8 weeks, where it was sold out with 5 screenings a day. And that's not the way most people think about documentaries. What's been interesting in the last 5 years is that documentaries have begun to be seen as not just the poor cousin of the movies, but actually a viable form and format of its own. But I still don't like most of the documentaries that get made, because I think they're just too busy telling me stuff. Whereas I want to feel stuff, and I want the camera work to be interesting. And there are plenty of people doing this, but I've been lucky with mine. And the luckiest thing is that when the film When We Were Kings about Muhammad Ali won the Oscar, somehow or other people thought I'd directed it. A lot of people thought I'd directed it, and which I hadn't. But because it became so famous, and one of the great breakthrough documentaries in terms of playing in cinemas all around the world, and it made a lot of money. And but because of it, I began getting work as a director.
Oh. So that publicity kind of that misinformation helped you in your career. Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, 20 years later than I originally hoped to transfer out of documentaries into movies, I finally, or from producing into directing, I finally, because of a misunderstanding about When We Were Kings, started getting commissioned as a director. And I produce my own films because I like to have full control of what I do. The Ali film, I'll tell you a little bit since you asked. It's about the rumble in the jungle, Muhammad Ali's first fight with George Foreman, or actually only fight with George Foreman in what was the Congo and was then Zaire, under the dictator Mobutu. And at that point, Ali hadn't boxed professionally for a while because he'd been barred, because he refused to accept being drafted by the American army and sent to Vietnam. He objected to the war, and he took a very brave stance, but it meant that he was stripped of his heavyweight championship. So he had a lot riding on this, and he was 34. And everyone knew that Foreman was a killing machine. If he hit you once, you'd lose. And everyone thought Ali would lose. And the movie, When We Were Kings, is the story of why and how he won. And it had been filmed in 1974, nothing to do with me at all, by a team of filmmakers who had been hired to cover not the fight, but a Black American music festival for 3 days that was scheduled to run alongside the fight in Kinshasa.
Oh.
And George Foreman got a cut over his eye in training, so they had to suspend the original date for the fight until he was healed. And Mobutu didn't want to lose the foreign media, so he took away everyone's passports. So the crew that was there for the music event couldn't leave, and they had nothing to do, and Ali let them hang out with him. Foreman wouldn't. Foreman took his training much more seriously than Ali, because deep down Ali thought he might lose. It didn't matter. You know? And the result was we had this incredible footage, but the filmmakers famously, this is 1974, for the next 20 years, the footage floated around Hollywood like a white elephant or a great white whale. And everyone knew it was exhausted, it was unmakeable, it was it was ridiculous. And I somehow got the rights to the footage.
Oh.
And a friend and neighbor of mine in Los Angeles is Taylor Hackford, who made Officer and a Gentleman, and he made several documentaries as well. Hail Hail Rock and Roll about Chuck Berry, and Devil's Advocate with Al Pacino and Charlize Theron, and a big 800-pound gorilla in the Hollywood scene. And he's an American, all-American California guy who's really into sports. And I didn't know much about sports, but I went over next door to his house and I showed him the footage. And I said, I'd like you to direct it. And, you know, because you're an American guy and you know sports, and but you also know music. And we've got all this great footage of James Brown and the American R&B crowd. And he took it on and edited it.
Okay.
We shot a lot of new footage. We shot interviews with Spike Lee and Norman Mailer and people to tell the story, but we also put the fight into the film.
Yeah.
So that the film is a fight movie. It's not a concert movie, but it's got a great concert as counterpoint to the fight. And I knew it'd win an Oscar, but the company backing me didn't believe it. So at the last moment, they didn't pay out the final payment for the option of ownership on it. So, like all success stories, you have a million fathers. And so in the legal wrangling at the end of it, I was not, me and Taylor were not able to go on stage to receive the Oscar. And, but nevertheless, everyone knew we'd made the film. And so that was all right. And I spent a year where people were trying, when we were finishing it, trying to see it. I refused to show it to anybody. I was betting entirely on getting it into the Sundance Film Festival, which was a great platform for launching an exciting film. And so I wouldn't let anyone see it. And so there was a bidding frenzy at Sundance when it opened. And I think it got the highest advance the documentary had ever had. And it's still a very high advance, $3.6 million. But it well made that back. But after that, I began purely directing my own films. So am I giving you too much detail?
No. It's great. It's great. Everything you're telling me is absolutely wonderful. And yeah, I'm getting to know about the journey, and it's a great thing. And yeah, since you talked about Oscars, there's another movie of yours, another film that you've produced, that is Born Into Brothels, which is, I think,
Yes.
yeah.
I opened 5 or 6 of my films at the Sundance Festival, which I've just mentioned, and I've opened 6 films at the Toronto Festival, one of the biggest festivals in the world. But because of my long association with Sundance, the Sundance Institute asked me to help run their summer workshops for producers and directors and stuff. And I was brought in 2 years running. Because music plays such a big part in my films, I was one of the people coaching emerging filmmakers in how to use music in their films. And also because my editing on documentaries is much more cinematic than others, I was teaching that lab. They're called labs, laboratories. And these 2 filmmakers came in with the rough cut of a film they'd shot in Calcutta, in the area in Calcutta called Sonagachi, which is like the red light district. Yeah. And it was the story of a young American woman of Iraqi descent who was a photojournalist. And she wanted to do a film about the prostitutes living in the brothels. And so she moved into one in Sonagachi. Mm-hmm. And what she found was that all the children, little kids of the prostitutes, they live with them, and they'd never seen camera like this or anything before, so they'd follow her around. Okay. And she was astonished to find out that these women each woman lived in one small room, and when they had a client, they would pull a little curtain across, and their kid would be on the other side of the curtain listening, you know, and it was a violent place. The men were always high on drugs and beating up the women, and ghastly. And the kids couldn't go to school because as they were utterly untouchable. No school would have them. And then, so they were just living in this building. They'd never seen the sea, you know. So she starts getting involved with the kids, and they want to know what she's doing. So she buys them all little disposable Kodak box cameras, those ones that used to be around in the 90s and before full digital kicked in. And she gave them workshops how to shoot. And then they began photographing their lives from their 3 foot high, their perspective. And what you learn from their photographs is that where they're living might look like a hellhole to outsiders, but it's just their daily life. Yeah. So in the best form of anthropology, you're within a culture or a society, yeah, and everything around you is normal to you. Yeah. And the anthropologist sees what's abnormal about it. But the photographs are extraordinary, these kids. And some of them became very good photographers. And as a result of the film, 2 of them got big scholarships to do photography, one in Amsterdam, I think one in New York, and have gone on to have careers. But there was one girl there who was just 12, I think, or she was about to turn 12 or 13, and the pimps had all done it. The mother of the girl, who was a prostitute there, had done a deal. She'd sold the girl to the pimps, and on her birthday, she was scheduled to be gang raped by them and introduced to drugs to make her dependent. And so the girl in the movie, the photographer, starts trying to get this little girl into a school. And no school will have her, and she goes round and round more and more desperately as the girl's birthday approaches. Yeah. And she finally finds some nuns or something who are willing, I think they're Catholics, they're willing to take her in. So she gets her into them, and you're so relieved. Really? And 3 weeks later, she runs away from that school and comes back to the brothel because she didn't like the food. Oh my God. So you come out of this film broken. They had no idea, these 2 filmmakers, how to actually go beyond the footage they'd shot. So I, after working with them at the lab for 2 weeks, I went back to New York with them and recut an opening for them to help give them a roadmap how to finish the film. Yeah. And then I got my lawyer involved, who sold the film to HBO for them, and then HBO did an Oscar campaign for them, and it won an Oscar. So that's the story of that film. And what I'm interested, of course, in the photography aspect of it as well. And she takes them out to the sea. They've never seen the sea, and it's a remarkable film. And I think it rightfully won the Oscar. I mean, I knew When We Were Kings was going to win the Oscar, because between John Kennedy and O.J. Simpson, there's no American heroes left. And I thought Ali is the last American hero. And I thought, and that year he lit when I saw him light the Olympic torch, yeah, shaking. So I realized we'd win an Oscar. Whoa, wow, that's great. That was a no-brainer, that one. And the music's so great. So yeah, one thing I just wanted to ask you is that in India, I think for the last 7 or 8 years, we've had this concept of biopics. So biopics are basically, they are not exactly documentaries, but they are like a fictional representation of the stories of, I think, sports persons or athletes or politicians who people know. So while making these documentaries, did you ever did the thought of making something completely fictional or like a typical larger than life Hollywood movie come to your mind, or you just wanted to make films that are more realistic and storytelling, and the storytelling is there and they are engaging and captivating at the same time? So what was when did you make up your mind exactly to just make documentaries? That's what I want to know. Well, two thoughts. One is quite a few of my films have been remade as Hollywood movies. Oh. For instance, When We Were Kings got remade as Ali with Will Smith starring in it. Will Smith, yeah. And the Phil Spector film got remade by David Mamet, the famous playwright, with Al Pacino as Phil Spector and Helen Mirren as the lawyer. But that's a remake of my documentary. I think I've had 4 of my documentaries. And what I've learned from that is the movie is never as good as my documentary, because you're looking at the real thing. And you're looking at the real human experience. You're not, yes, you impose a narrative structure on it. You deploy the same techniques as you do with drama. Or, sorry, with fiction. But I find it supercharged by the fact it's also true. And so I've never thought that it would be interesting for me to make a fictionalized version of a real story. Yeah, because the things people do are extraordinary. Some of the things the people I've filmed with do, if that was in a movie, no one would believe it. Because what people get up to, you know, there's that expression, truth is stranger than fiction. But that brings me to a theme of mine as a filmmaker, which is, I believe there's a difference between fact and truth. Literature and art aspires to something truthful. Journalism aspires to something factual. And the great German literary critic, Walter Benjamin, who died in World War II, he wrote an essay defining these two different languages that people either write with or, in my case, make films with. One is the language of information, which is what most documentaries are in and bore me stupid. The other is the language of experience, which is about emotion and living your life, living things. And that sucks you in and carries you along. You feel you've lived through it and you know what killed Kennedy. It doesn't matter who killed Kennedy anymore. Garry Kasparov playing IBM is kind of a rumination, not on artificial intelligence. I do think that artists frequently explore the darknesses they find within themselves. And a gust of wind slapped it against the side of this. So the camera is running as the helicopter is plummeting down, and it's right on top of the girl. So, and she hears the sound, and she looks up. She hears a helicopter's engine failing. When you get to the sort of power that he had, you can behave as badly as you want because no one's going to say no to you. And he got more and more. You know, you said love. I don't love these people. I want to find out what it feels like to be them. I want to understand people who are not like me. I want to feel what they feel. And I also make my films for myself, not for the audience. I mean, I'm lucky that audiences love them. He was always a gun nut, and he'd always pull out the gun, and he tried to rape a friend of mine years ago in a hotel with a gun. And I was talking to Ringo Starr, the Beatles drummer. We were talking about doing a film together, and he used to share a back fence of his house in Beverly Hills with the back fence of where Phil Spector's house was. And Phil was always in the back, he said, firing off his guns. And he said, you know, he's a gun nut. And if you're a gun nut, one day someone's going to die. And then he said, you can't take away his music.